All right. Welcome back to Book by Book. And tonight we're going to be looking at Deuteronomy chapter 8 through 11. And Deuteronomy is Moses's last sermon before the people of Israel go into the promised land. And as he is preparing them, he's going over the law with them again. And a lot of these early chapters are rehearsing the history of the people of Israel. And it's important for them to remember what God has done, because as we look through tonight, we're going to see that one of the dangers is that they would forget God's provision and his grace and his love for them. And so the law and the festivals and all these different things that are put in place for the people of Israel, the goal is that the law would be tied to memory, not just to routine, like to a memory of God's presence and faithfulness. So we're going to look through 8, 9, 10, and 11 today. And we're going to, there's some really interesting stuff in this section. And there's some passages that Jesus quotes as well. So we'll talk a little bit about that early on here. So chapter 8, verse 1. Be careful to follow every command I am giving you today, so that you may live and increase and may enter and possess the land the Lord promised on oath to your ancestors. Remember how the Lord your God led you all the way in the wilderness these 40 years, to humble and test you in order to know what was in your heart, whether or not you would keep his commands. He humbled you, causing you to hunger, and then feeding you with manna, which neither you nor your ancestors had known, to teach you that man does not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord. Your clothes did not wear out, and your feet did not swell during these 40 years. Know then in your heart that as a man disciplines his son, so the Lord your God disciplines you. Observe the commands of the Lord your God, walking in obedience to him and revering him. For the Lord your God is bringing you into a good land, a land with brooks, streams, and deep springs gushing out into the valleys and hills, a land with with wheat and barley, vines and figs, pomegranates, olive oil, and honey, a land where bread will not be scarce and you will lack nothing, a land where the rocks are iron and you can dig copper out of the hills. We'll pause here. As we are jumping in, Moses is saying, remember to do the things, to follow these commands, and remember what God has done for the people of Israel. And the folks that he's talking to now are the second generation after the people have been liberated from slavery in Egypt. And so they have seen God's provision firsthand. They didn't necessarily all experience the miraculous rescue from Egypt, but they have seen over the last 40 years how God has been involved in providing for them. And there's a couple of interesting things that are highlighted. The first one is the Lord that I want to look at is the Lord humbled them and tested them. And the humbling is in order to help them to see their dependence upon the Lord. And so not to help them to never have the thought that we can do this on our own. But the Lord humbled them. So when they had those moments of hunger and they said, why are we out here? And where's the food? And then the Lord provided for them. And so he humbled them and tested them and then answered the test himself. I will provide for you. And here we have this passage that the Lord gave them manna, which was a whole new thing to them and their ancestors. And he did this not just to feed them, but to teach them that man does not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord. And this is one of the passages that Jesus quotes in the temptation when the tempter comes to Jesus and says, if you are truly the Son of God, turn these stones into bread. And the Lord says, the man does not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord. And so here we have this callback that in Jesus's ministry and in this resistance against the tempter, he quotes scripture. He remembers that the way the Lord has provided for the people of Israel. And Jesus is essentially creating in the early church and the disciples, he's creating a new community, a restoration of Israel with the disciples. And so here, even in his temptation, the 40 days, we are reminded through his response. It's not about food. It's not about material that we can do, but to trust the Lord that he can provide along the way. And the Lord does provide these material goods, but he also wants us to just trust his word. Another interesting thing, and as a parent of teenagers, this is something that is truly impressive. The Lord says that your clothes did not wear out, or your feet did not swell over the last 40 years. And so the Lord even cared for the garments that they made. And, this was not easy living for 40 years, but they always had clothes. And so fast forward again to Jesus and his ministry, and he tells the people in the Sermon on the Mount, like, don't worry about what you will eat or what you will wear, for the Lord cares for the flowers. He dresses them. How much more will he care for you? Those kinds of things are intentionally calling back to these kinds of provision passages in the Old Testament to say, look at what God can do. And so Jesus's ministry is not about just throwing out the Old Testament, but getting back to the heart of the law, getting back to what does God want for his people, and how does God want to relate to his people, and to care for them in ways that are obviously his provision. And so he's in here saying, obey the Lord as you head into the promised land. And you should obey because you've already seen his goodness. You've already received his blessing. And so as a response to his blessing, obey. And then also, even moving into the land, he's saying the land is good. It has all these vineyards and all these produce, all this great stuff. It's good. You can just go and pick up precious metals and you don't have to work hard to mine. You can just go get them. This is how good and abundant the land that the Lord is leading the people to is. And so it's a powerful picture of God's provision in the past to the future of God's provision. And it continues on in verse 10. When you have eaten and are satisfied, praise the Lord your God for the good land he has given you. Be careful that you do not forget the Lord your God, failing to observe his commands, his laws, and his decrees that I am giving you this day. Otherwise, when you eat and are satisfied, when you build fine houses and settle down, and when your herds and flocks grow large, and your silver and gold increase, and all you have is multiplied, then your heart will become proud, and you will forget the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. He led you through the vast and dreadful wilderness, that thirsty and waterless land, with its venomous snakes and scorpions. He brought you water out of hard rock. He gave you manna to eat in the wilderness, something your ancestors had never known, to humble and test you, so that in the end it might go well with you. You may say to yourself, my power and the strength of my hands have produced this wealth for me. But remember the Lord your God, for it is he who gives you the ability to produce wealth, and so confirms his covenant, which he swore to your ancestors as it is today. If you ever forget that the Lord your God and follow other gods and worship and bow down to them, I testify against you today that you will surely be destroyed, like the nations the Lord destroyed before you. So you will be destroyed for not obeying the Lord. And so this theme of do not forget is back. Like, do not forget all that God has done, because when you move in and you get comfortable, you might think, yeah, things are going pretty good. I'm fine. Or even worse, like, I did this. And one of the great challenges, even in our culture today, is the idea of the self-made person. And the Bible, as we read through scripture, we see over and over again that the Bible just rejects that idea altogether. There are no self-made people. It is God's provision and his provision of the blessings that we have, also the provision of the ability to do work. All of these things come from the Lord. And so he is, and Moses is telling them, like, don't forget all this comes from God. But if you start to think you've got it figured out, the Lord will humble you. the Lord will correct you. And what's worse than thinking they've got it figured out is if they were to misattribute the blessings of the Lord to one of the deities of the Canaanites. And that's what verse 19 is talking about. If you ever forget the Lord and follow other gods, so you forgot what God has done for you, but like Baal here, Baal's pretty great. The Lord promises them to destroy them. And this destruction is a discipline action. Like, you have rejected me, and now I will reject you from the land that I have made for you. And fast forward in the Old Testament, the people, they did this. They rejected God's provision. They forgot his goodness. They followed after other gods, and eventually they were taken out of the land for the exile for about 70 years with the tribe of Judah in Babylon. Before that, the northern tribes were gone. And so we have like these foreshadowing passages in Deuteronomy that are saying, if you do this, this will happen. And it is what happened. And so as Moses is telling them this, like he's saying, the Lord will drive out these other nations before you, but don't think you've got it figured out and you don't need the Lord, because he will do the same to you that he did to those nations. And so there's a strong warning, but the warning starts with the invitation to remember what God has done. And so let's look at chapter 9. Hear, Israel, you are now about to cross the Jordan to go in and dispossess nations greater and stronger than you, with large cities that have walls up to the sky. The people are strong and tall, Anakites. You know about them and have heard it said, who could stand up against the Anakites? But be assured today that the Lord your God is the one who goes across ahead of you like a devouring fire. He will destroy them. He will subdue them before you, and you will drive them out and annihilate them quickly, as the Lord has promised you. After the Lord your God has driven them out before you, do not say to yourself, the Lord has brought me here to take possession of the land because of my righteousness. No, it is on account of the wickedness of these nations that the Lord is going to drive them out before you. It is not because of your righteousness or your integrity that you are going to take possession of their land, but on account of the wickedness of these nations. The Lord your God will drive them out before you to accomplish what he swore to your fathers, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Understand then that it is not because of your righteousness that the Lord your God is giving you this good land to possess, for you are a stiff-necked people. I love Moses in times like this. It's just like, you're not as cool as you think you are, which is something that everybody needs people in their life to remind them, you're not as cool as you think you are. But before we get too far into that, Moses is saying, you're about to go over into the land. 40 years ago, your ancestors, they were about to go into the land, and they said, the people are too big, their cities are too strong, we can't do it. And that is why they wandered in the wilderness these 40 years, because they lacked the faith to trust that the Lord would fight for them. And so here Moses is saying, we've got another shot here. You have these mega tall people, the Anakites. And as we've talked about in the past, the Anakites, there's some who believe that the Anakites are a descendant of the Nephilim, and the Nephilim could be this supernatural union of some sort between the sons of God and the daughters of men in Genesis 6, and if they became these giants, and so there's a lot of mystery around the Anakites, but they are big, they are strong, and their walls are tall, all the way to the sky, it says here. But the Lord is saying, I'm going first. I'm going ahead of you. I'm going to drive them out, and I'm going to do it quickly. And throughout all of this is the Lord is trying to tell the people, like, trust me, follow me. These will not be long, drawn out battles, city to city, but each time we attack, the Lord will fight for you. But again, don't think like, well, we're such great military leaders and great fighting forces. We've got this figured out. And here the Lord's like, no, it's not because you're so good. It's not because you're so righteous. It's because of God's plan. God sees the wickedness of the nations in the land that he promised to Abraham and Abraham's descendants. The wicked practices of these different people groups, the Canaanites and their practice worshiping Baal and Ashtoreth and all of these different demonic entities. And so the Lord is saying, I'm driving them out because I want them gone. And he is employing the people of Israel to join him in that work. So it's not their righteousness, it's God's righteousness and God's will to drive these people out. And so again, he's trying to fight against the pride that creeps up into people when they see success, and they think that it is their own doing that leads them to that success. And so right after he talks about, don't think you're so great. Remember, you're stiff-necked people. You're stubborn as all get out, to the people of Israel. And then in verse 7, he gives them an example of how this plays out. Verse 7, remember this, and never forget how you aroused the anger of the Lord your God in the wilderness. From the day you left Egypt until you arrived here, you have been rebellious against the Lord. Now, the people who are here right now that Moses is talking to, they were not the ones who were leading in this event that we're about to read. It was their parents. But Moses is still saying, you were there, because Moses has an idea of corporate identity that is greater than the individual, but the individuals make up Israel. And Israel is more than just one generation. It is the people of Israel. And so while these people weren't there, Moses is saying you were there because God sees you as the people, right? So verse 8, at Horeb, you aroused the Lord's wrath so that he was angry enough to destroy you. When I went up on the mountain to receive the tablets of stone, the tablets of the covenant that the Lord has made with you, I stayed on the mountain 40 days and 40 nights. I ate no bread and drank no water. The Lord gave me 2 stone tablets inscribed by the finger of God. On them were all the commandments the Lord proclaimed to you on the mountain out of the fire on the day of the assembly. At the end of the 40 days and 40 nights, the Lord gave me 2 stone tablets, the tablets of the covenant. Then the Lord told me, go down from here at once, because your people, whom you brought out of Egypt, have become corrupt. They have turned away quickly from what I commanded them and have made an idol for themselves. And the Lord said to me, I have seen this people, and they are stiff-necked people indeed. Let me alone, so that I may destroy them and blot out their name from under heaven, and I will make you into a nation stronger and more numerous than they. So I turned and went down from the mountain while it was ablaze with fire, and the 2 stone tablets of the covenant were in my hand. When I looked, I saw that you had sinned against the Lord your God. You had made for yourselves an idol cast out of the shape of a calf. You had turned aside quickly from the way the Lord had commanded you. So I took the 2 tablets and threw them out of my hands, breaking them to pieces before your eyes. Then once again, I fell prostrate before the Lord for 40 days and 40 nights. I ate no bread and drank no water because of all the sin you had committed, doing what was evil in the Lord's sight, and so arousing his anger. I feared the anger and the wrath of the Lord, for he was angry enough with you to destroy you. But again, the Lord listened to me, and the Lord was angry enough with Aaron to destroy him. But at that time, I prayed for Aaron too. I also took that sinful thing of yours, the calf you had made, and burned it in the fire. Then I crushed it and ground it to the powder as fine as dust, and threw the dust into the stream that flowed down the mountain. So Moses is reminding them of the golden calf incident. So the people heard the Lord speak in Exodus 20. They heard the Lord speak to them directly, the 10 commandments. And one of the 10 commandments is, you shall make no graven images. Because God cannot be contained to an image. You should not worship any of these graven images. And so Moses goes up to the mountain for 40 days. And while he's up there, the people are like, I guess Moses might be dead. Aaron, make us a thing to worship. And so Aaron does, and they make this golden calf. Now the calf imagery is interesting because it is part of the Canaanite worship. The calves were present in different kinds of Canaanite pagan worship, but part of it was that they depicted often the deity, the idol, standing on the back of these calves, like the calf or the ox or whatever was carrying them. And so that could be one of the motivations for the people is like, well, we're not going to make an image of God, but we're going to make like God's transportation. And we're going to worship that because we have to worship something. But this was clearly a rejection of God's commands to them. And so in this moment, the Lord is angry enough to just start over. And we've seen the Lord do this in Genesis 6. The Lord started over with Noah's family. And then in Genesis 12, we see the Lord starting the nation with Abraham. And so here what God is saying is like, let me destroy them, Moses, and I will start a whole new nation with you. But the Lord listened to Moses' prayers to not destroy the people. And instead he relented. He gave them a invitation to grace, an extension of grace, I should say. But they still suffered for it. There were still some consequences for this. But the more Moses interceded for the people, the more he understood how stiff-necked they were. And so this is like one of the prime examples of their rebellious ways. But he goes on in verse 22, you also made the Lord angry at Taberah and Massa and at Kibroth Hattaavah. And when the Lord sent you out from Kadesh Barnea, he said, go up and take the possession of the land I've given you. But you rebelled against the command of the Lord your God. You did not trust him or obey him. You have been rebellious against the Lord ever since I have known you. I lay prostrate before the Lord these 40 days and 40 nights because the Lord had said he would destroy you. I prayed to the Lord. It said, Sovereign Lord, do not destroy your people, your own inheritance that you have redeemed by your great power and brought out of Egypt with a mighty hand. Remember your servants, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. Overlook the stubbornness of this people, their wickedness and their sin. Otherwise, the country from which you brought us will say, because the Lord was not able to take them into the land he had promised them, and because he hated them, he brought them out to put them to death in the wilderness. But they are your people, your inheritance, that you brought out by your great power and your outstretched arm. So Moses is reminding them of the ways that they have been stiff-necked, but then also he's saying, so look, you're not that great. You're stiff-necked people, you're rebellious. It's not your righteousness that is leading God to do these things. It's because God made a promise to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and he's holding on to that promise. And so even in Moses' prayer, he calls back to God's promise to the people, their forefathers. And so in his prayer, he is saying, please relent, please save them for your promise to them, but also you defeated Egypt. And if you wipe us all out here, Egypt will say, who is Yahweh? Who is the Lord that we should worry about him? It's because the Lord is weak. It's because he hated these people. Whatever it is, wiping out the people of Israel, Moses is saying will diminish the Lord's esteem with the nations. And Israel is supposed to build God, the Lord's esteem, point to his goodness, glorify him in all they say and do. And so Moses is saying, if you do this, that won't happen. So Moses is convincing the Lord and he relents. And so in chapter 10 picks up, at that time, the Lord said to me, chisel out 2 stone tablets like the first ones and come up to me on the mountain. Also make a wooden ark. I will write on the tablets the words that were on the first tablets, which you broke. Then you are to put them in the ark. So I made the ark out of acacia wood and chiseled out 2 stone tablets like the first ones. And I went up on the mountain with the 2 tablets in my hands. The Lord wrote on these tablets what he had written before, the 10 commandments he had proclaimed to you on the mountain out of the fire on the day of the assembly. And the Lord gave them to me. Then I came back down the mountain and put the tablets in the ark I had made as the Lord commanded me, and they are there now. Just pause here. Like as we went through all of the Exodus and Leviticus, the whole process of making the ark, that whole process took about a year to do all of the tabernacle elements. And so here, as Moses is recounting these, I just want to note that Moses is not as concerned with chronology as we might be. And so he's saying, like, I went up there and I did all this and it's all at one time, but it wasn't all kind of at one time. but when the ark was finished, the tablets were put in the ark. And these tablets are representing the covenant, and it's not uncommon for people to make a covenant and to give each other copies of the covenant, especially between a greater kingdom and a lesser kingdom, which is kind of what Deuteronomy is based on, a suzerain and a vassal treaty. And so these tablets are, God's covenant with the people, and putting them in the ark is one of the ways that they can maintain the significance of the covenant. It's like this is something that is in one of the most sacred objects for the people of Israel, and it's not an idol. It's basically God's footstool. But they're never supposed to worship the ark. They're never supposed to worship the tablets. These are all signs to them of God's glory, and they worship the Lord alone. Anyway, so back to verse 6. The Israelites traveled from the wells of Bene Jaakan and Mazarah. There Aaron died and was buried, and Eleazar his son succeeded him as priest. From there they traveled to Gudgodah on the Jotbatah, a land with streams of water. At that time the Lord set apart the tribe of Levi to carry the ark of the covenant of the Lord, to stand before the Lord, to minister and to pronounce blessings in his name, as they still do today. That is why the Levites have no share of the inheritance among their fellow Israelites. The Lord was their inheritance, as the Lord your God told them. And so that little aside there is saying, like, this is what happened to Aaron when he died. Remember, like, his descendants, the Levites and his sons, like, they are the priestly class. They're the ones who are going to do all the work of the tabernacle. They stand before the Lord. And so even as he's going through the history, that Moses is still telling them, like, remember this, remember this, remember this. Remember what the Levites are supposed to do, why they don't have land, like a parcel of land for just the Levites. They're scattered throughout because they represent the Lord to you and you to the Lord. Verse 10, now I had stayed on the mountain 40 days, 40 nights, as I did the first time. And the Lord listened to me at this time also. It was not his will to destroy you. Go, the Lord said to me, and lead the people on their way, so that they may enter and possess the land I swore to their ancestors to give them. And so, yes, this has been a kind of a digression about the law or the covenant, and how the Lord gave them all gave them the law, gave them the priests, built the tabernacle structures and all the elements, all of these different things, all to remember who the Lord is and what the Lord has done for them. Because if they don't remember, they will forget. And if they forget, then they might abandon the Lord. And if they abandon the Lord and follow after other gods, then the Lord will destroy the people. And so all of this is tied back into remember, remember, remember. So in verse 12, Moses says, and now Israel, what does the Lord your God ask of you? But to fear the Lord your God and walk in obedience to him, to love him, to serve the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul, and to observe the Lord's commands and decrees that I am giving you today for your own good. To the Lord your God belongs the heavens, even the highest heavens, the earth, and everything in it. Yet the Lord set his affection on your ancestors and loved them. And he chose you, their descendants, above all the nations, as it is today. Circumcise your hearts, therefore, and do not be stiff-necked any longer. For the Lord your God is God of gods and Lord of lords, and the great God, mighty and awesome, who shows no partiality and accepts no bribes. He defends the cause of the fatherless, the widow, and loves the foreigner residing among you, giving them food and clothing. And you are to love those who are foreigners, for you yourselves were foreigners in Egypt. Fear the Lord your God and serve him. Hold fast to him and take your oaths in his name. He is the one you praise. He is your God who performed for you those great and awesome wonders you saw with your own eyes. Your ancestors who went down into Egypt were 70 in all, and now the Lord your God has made you as numerous as the stars in the sky. And so Moses is saying, so remember all that God has done, and what he's calling you to is to fear him, to revere him, to understand his power and his majesty, to walk with him and to obey his commands and decrees, because he's done all of this because he loves you, the people of Israel. He He loves your ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He had affection for them, and he promised them that he would do all of these wonderful things for them. And so today, Moses is challenging them to trust the Lord, to not just like, yeah, I know I should do these right things, but in their heart to be transformed. And the image that he uses is to circumcise your hearts. And for the people of Israel, they had the mark of circumcision as a removing of the foreskin and for the boys. But here, this message is to everybody. To circumcise their hearts is to remove the nature of the world from their hearts, so that their heart can be fully devoted, set apart, distinct to the Lord. And so when he's calling them essentially to repent of before crossing the Jordan and into a new relationship as they do cross in to the Jordan. But then he also says all of these characteristics of the Lord, gives these titles: the Lord of Lords, the great God, mighty and awesome. He is the God of gods. Like, he is unique. He is distinct. He is the only one worthy of praise. So trust him. And his character shows that he is worth trusting and worth worshiping, because he doesn't show partiality. He cares for the vulnerable and the weak. And because God cares for the vulnerable and the weak, the people then should also care for the vulnerable and the weak, remembering who they were when they were slaves in Egypt. They were foreigners, and so they must love foreigners. Here, like, that idea of being a community that welcomes the other is not natural for so many even today. Like, there's a tendency to try to protect ourselves from unknown people, stranger danger. But then also, like, just cultures that are different. Like, if you don't understand that like the ways of a culture, you might feel very nervous around people, or going to new countries, or having people from other countries come to your region. And these are things that are in us because humanity, we have a suspicious bent. We don't always trust. And here the Lord is saying, like, love the other, love the vulnerable, love the fatherless, the widow, the poor, the foreigner, because God loves them. He cares for them as well. And so, this is something that, when Jesus calls us to love our enemies, one of the ways we could think about that too is like just to love the stranger, the person who is different than you. They're not supposed to be your enemy. They're supposed to be a brother or a sister made in the image of God, and to love them as they are. And so, so God did all these things for the people of Israel to rescue them, to lead them into a relationship of obedience, and that he would be the focus of their praise in all things. And when it says he is the one you praise in the NIV, the text is actually, he is your praise. Like, not just the one you praise, he is praise, and he is your praise, which is a much more direct thing. Like, when you praise, it is the Lord. Anyway, I'll stop. One more chapter 11. Love the Lord your God and keep his requirements, his decrees, his laws, and his commands always. Remember today that your children were not the ones who saw and experienced the discipline of the Lord your God, his majesty, his mighty hand, his outstretched arm, the signs he performed, and the things he did in the hearts of Egypt, both to Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and to his whole country. What he did to the Egyptian army, to its horses and chariots, how he overwhelmed them with the waters of the Red Sea as they were pursuing you, and how the Lord brought lasting ruin on them. It was not your children who saw what he did for you in the wilderness until you arrived at this place, and where he did to Dathan and Abiram, sons of Eliab, the Reubenite, when the earth opened its mouth right in the middle of all Israel and swallowed them up with the households, their tents, and every living thing that belonged to them. But it was your own eyes that saw all these great things the Lord has done. Observe, therefore, all the commands I am giving you today, so that you may have the strength to go in and take over the land that you are crossing the Jordan to possess, and so that you may live long in the land the Lord swore to your ancestors to give them and their descendants, a land flowing with milk and honey. The land you are entering to take over is not like the land of Egypt, from which you have come, where you planted your seed and irrigated it by foot as in a vegetable garden. But the land you are crossing the Jordan to take possession of is a land of mountains and valleys, and that drinks rain from heaven, and is a land the Lord your God cares for. The eyes of the Lord your God are continually on it, from the beginning of the year to its end. And so even here, the Lord's saying, Moses is telling the people, like, all the things that the Lord did, your kids didn't experience it, you did. But as you remember, like, these people, they also didn't experience it. Their parents did. And so there's a sense here that, like, the history of the people of Israel is, when looked at from the perspective of God, there is a eternal now of, like, the story of Israel that happened in the past is your story, Israel, today. So it is you. There's no, like, well, that was hundreds of years ago. Like, no, it's you. It's you. You are the people. Even that was 40 years ago. No, it's you. You are the ones who experience these things, because Israel is a unit. Israel is the nation. And so the Lord is making these relationships with the nations. So it's not just, so they need to remember, because it's their story. Even if they didn't experience it directly, it was still their story. And so he's calling them and reminds them even here again, like, of the Lord's discipline to the people of Egypt. Well, look what the Lord did there. Look what he did to Dathan and Abiram when they disobeyed. The Lord swallowed them up. And so trust the Lord, observe all these commandments. And then he says, and trust him as he leads you and drives these nations out, because the land that he's given you is a good land. It's a wonderful land. And he contrasts it with Egypt. And there's some interesting things going on in this contrast, because Egypt had the Nile River, and the Nile, along the banks of the Nile, it was fairly fertile, but they had to build irrigation canals and all kinds of different ways to water their crops. And so there are, he says, the land you're going to now is not like Egypt, where you had to plant your seed and irrigated it by foot as in a vegetable garden. And that imagery is interesting. And this is one of the times where you read the Bible and like, that's weird. What does that mean? And so there's some people who, commentators who look at this and say, there must have been some kind of water pump situation where they would press it with their foot and they would draw water up and get that into, irrigation for their crops. But there are other passages that indicate in the prophets where like the famine that's going to come across the land is going to be so severe that they won't have water to irrigate their crops. And so when they would say watering by foot, it's a euphemism for urinating on your crops, because that's all the moisture that you can muster. And so that is a stark image. Like the Egypt was so hard for you. Like, is this what the Lord is saying? Egypt was hard. And as you read through the story of Pharaoh interacting with the people of Israel, like, he made their lives even harder. And so, like, if they had crops, were they forced to, like, find moisture wherever they could, find water wherever they could, and to urinate on their crops to water them? Like, that's the kind of contrast that this passage is establishing. Is you had to make your own water to water your crops. But in the land that God has given you, there's hills, there's valleys, there's rivers, there's streams, and it rains on, and the Lord is taking care of that land. And this is the land that God is giving to you. So obey him and trust him, and don't try to think that you've got this all figured out on your own. You are strong, you are great. No, it is the Lord who is good. It is the Lord who is providing for you. So, as verse 13 says, if you faithfully obey the commands I am giving you today, to love the Lord your God and to serve him with all your heart and with all your soul, then I will send rain on your land in its season, both autumn and spring rains, so that you may gather in your grain, new wine, and olive oil. I will provide grass in the fields for your cattle, and you will eat and be satisfied. Be careful, or you will be enticed to turn away and worship other gods and bow down to them. Then the Lord's anger will burn against you, and he will shut up the heavens so that it will not rain, and the ground will yield no produce, and you will soon perish from the good land the Lord is giving you. Fix these words of mine in your hearts and minds. Tie them as symbols on your hands and bind them on your foreheads. Teach them to your children, talking about them when you sit at home and when you walk along the road, when you lie down and when you get up. Write them on the doorframes of your houses and on your gates, so that your days and the days of your children may be many in the land the Lord swore to give your ancestors, as many as the days that the heavens are above the earth. So again, obey the Lord is Moses' plea with the people. He wants the Lord wants to bless the people, and their obedience is one of the ways that they show that they're trusting him. And if they attribute that to any other god, then the Lord will dry up the land and stop bringing the rain. And as you remember the story of Elijah, the people were disobedient. They were following other gods, and the Lord brought a famine, and it didn't rain for years. And so the Lord fulfills his promises to the people. And one of the challenges is the Lord is patient with people for a long time. And it isn't until, things get really bad that we actually see these disciplinary actions come. But even then, the Lord sent Elijah to confront their idolatry, to defeat the prophets of Baal, to confront the wickedness of Ahab and Jezebel. And the Lord did bring rain again. And so even when the Lord brings these disciplinary actions, he will relent as the people turn back to him. And so Moses is warning the people, obey the Lord, obey the Lord, obey the Lord. Don't forget all that he has done for you. And so in verse 22, and this will be our last section that we'll look at tonight. If you carefully observe all these commands I am giving you to follow, to love the Lord your God, to walk in obedience to him, and to hold fast to him, then the Lord will drive out all these nations before you, and you will dispossess nations larger and stronger than you. Every place where you set your foot will be yours. Your territory will extend from the desert to Lebanon, and from the Euphrates River to the Mediterranean Sea. No one will be able to stand against you. The Lord your God, as he promised you, will put the terror and fear of you on the whole land wherever you go. See, I am setting before you today a blessing and a curse. The blessing if you obey the commands of the Lord your God that I am giving you today. The curse if you disobey the commands of the Lord your God and turn from the way that I command you today by following other gods, which you have not known. When the Lord your God has brought you into the land you are entering to possess, you are to proclaim on Mount Gerizim the blessings and on Mount Ebal the curses. As you know, these mountains are across the Jordan, westward toward the setting sun, near the great tree of Moreh, and in the territory of those Canaanites living in the Arabah, in the vicinity of Gilgal. You are about to cross the Jordan to enter and take possession of the land the Lord your God is giving you. When you have taken it over and are living there, be sure that you obey all the decrees and laws I am setting before you today. So Moses is saying, obey the Lord. He will drive out nations before you. They're going to be bigger and stronger, but your God is bigger and stronger than them and their gods. And so trust him and see how he brings the victory again and again and again. And then Moses says, when you get in, right now, I'm giving you a list of blessings and curses. When you get in, when you take the land, you need to go to Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal and read these blessings and curses and choose to trust the Lord, choose to obey. And, these two mountains, people have all kinds of reasons that maybe these two mountains, one was barren and that was the curses, and one was fruitful and that was the blessings. But the key hint here for why here, it's kind of middle of the land that the Lord is promising, but it's by the tree of Moreh. And that is where the Lord made the first covenant with Abraham. all the way back in Genesis, the Lord met with Abraham there in the land. And that's where he said, this is the land I'm giving to your descendants. And so the people who are, 70 when they went to Egypt, and now they're a multitude about to take the land. The Lord is saying, like, go to this place where I met with Abraham and recite the covenant. Abraham longed for the day when his descendants would fill this land, and that's the day. And so this is a significant place, not because of the geography of the mountains, but because of the tree that is there. That is where the Lord met with Abraham. And so the Lord keeps his promises. His timing is different than our timing, but all throughout this passage, it's remember what the Lord has done. He's promised to do this. Don't forget. Don't turn away. If you turn away, curses will come upon you. But if you trust and obey, there will be wonderful things that God will continue to do, because he's already been doing wonderful things for the people of Israel. So Deuteronomy 8 through 11. Any thoughts or questions as we wrap up this section of scripture?
So Moses wrote all this down on scrolls, all that we're reading today, right?
Yeah. I mean, yes, possibly. Yeah, it was written down. There are some things that are there are some evidences of maybe some later editorial work like that, like to bring a little bit more clarification at different points that throughout Deuteronomy. So like in Deuteronomy, we're going to read about Moses's death, but like he didn't write that. So those kinds of things
Right.
are in there. So when you say Moses wrote all these things down, I have great confidence that Moses wrote the vast majority of this down. But I can't say 100%, like every word was penned by Moses. So I just want to caveat that.
The ones we're reading today.
Yeah. I mean, Moses wrote these, yeah. So why
They
do you
could go
ask,
they could go read them. I don't know. Only the priest could read, right?
I don't know how many people could read, but literacy is a great blessing of our age, but it isn't necessarily the same for people back then. But they probably could remember a lot better than we can, and so there was a oral tradition that people would have been able to like hear and repeat things. And even in the passages, one of the challenges I have with reading these passages out loud is how repetitive they are, because as I'm reading through the text, there are lines that look exactly the same as the line I just read, and I get lost. I'm like, did I just say this? But that repetitive nature is there to help people remember as they are hearing it, to be able to say like, the Lord your God did this, the Lord your God did this, the Lord your God did this, like, and to like tie it all together in their memory. So yeah, so whether or not they could read it, they probably would remember it a lot better than us. So yeah, long roundabout way of Bible nerding. So yeah, any other thoughts or questions, observations?
I got a question on that one. You know how you were just talking about how they have oral traditions where they carry down the stories. The fact that he has to reiterate it almost sounds like they didn't.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear part of what you said. Say that again.
Well, I'm saying, you just talked about that Israelites usually carried down stories orally. And the fact that he reiterates a lot of that kind of sounds like maybe they didn't, remember what your forefathers did. It's like, I thought they always handed those stories down generation to generation to generation. Yeah.
Well, they did. And so this book is Moses giving them one last time before he goes. So like they would have known the stories, but Moses is reinforcing the importance of remembering the stories. So it's not to say like they couldn't do the memory work of the oral tradition. But he's saying like, remember these stories because they tie to why we're obedient to the Lord. And so it doesn't like refute the oral tradition for the people as much as Moses is just saying like, it's really, 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 really important for you to remember this. So that's the emphasis that Moses is making here.
I just was going to say, I wonder if the newer generations, there was no, it was kind of, the story was carried down, but the lackluster was gone, the amazement from it.
Maybe. Yeah, that might be part of it. So like it's this evening at neighborhood table, one of the people who's serving, he's like 14 years old. And he was saying something about cassette tapes actually. And then he said like vinyl is not as good. And I was offended by that because vinyl's awesome. Like records sound amazing. And so there's like a generational superiority that can develop over time. And that's one of the reasons why Moses is saying like, hey, you're going to get in there and the land's going to be treating you real good. Don't forget what God did, that it wasn't your goodness that did this. Don't forget that Spotify hasn't always been a thing and you couldn't always have all the albums for $14 a month. Right. Like, don't forget. And these kinds of things, like where we, as time goes on, even now, generations look back on the past and say, how could they be so backwards? How could they be so wrong on so many things, in American history even. And we have to remember, like, we're not better than them. We're just in a different time than them. We're in a different age than them. And so we need to remember, like, what God is doing all throughout history is he's working. Even in church history, like God is working. And so like when churches mess up in the past, we can't just say, well, they're just bad and terrible. But it's like, no, God is still working with them and he's still working with us. And we're on this journey of transformation. And so for the people of Israel, they may have thought, yeah, God's cool and everything. Like, yeah, Egypt was neat, but really, what's God done for me lately is one of the big temptations for the people of Israel and for people today. What's God done for me lately? So,
yeah. You figure the people who saw it, it would be amazement. But as you carry on the story over and over again, I'm like, yeah, we've heard that story a lot. Yeah.
Well, sadly, the people who saw the Lord do these miraculous things to rescue them were also the same people who built the golden calf. Like that's like a few weeks from the events. Right. So it does not take long for us to forget God's goodness. So, one of the things, like this last several months, I've been meeting with more pastors, just because, we're all getting out and, it's been a year and a half of fewer face-to-face meetings. And now things are opening up and it's easier to meet with people. And one of the things that almost every meeting I have with their pastors, like, what have you learned over the last year and a half? What has COVID taught you? And how has the Lord sustained you through this very difficult season? And my prayer is, I never want to go through a global pandemic again. It's not fun. It's hard, but I do pray that we don't forget the ways that God has been teaching us to depend on him more and more. But we will forget if we don't remember, if we don't go back to the stories, if we don't rehearse God's goodness, we'll forget. So remember today what the Lord has done.
Is it kind of like that saying, those who do not know history are doomed to repeat it kind of scenario?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I really hope we don't repeat this whole COVID thing again in my lifetime or ever. Please help us, people. So, any other thoughts or observations from this passage?
I just thought it was really cool that I love the way that God kind of foreshadows and repeats. And so the place where he's asking them to proclaim the blessings and the curses is the same place where the original covenant was given. Like that,
Yeah.
that kind of stuff. Just like I get, like, yeah, I really geek out about that kind of stuff. So
Yeah. Well, it's significant, and
Yeah.
tradition goes on to say like that's close to where they built the temple. You know, like that. This is like these kinds of places are significant, and these kinds of moments are important to the people to remember. And so seeing the Lord do these kinds of work is, and seeing how they fit together, it's very significant. And when we read the Bible too fast, when we read it disjointed from itself, we miss this stuff. So, but God is very intentional throughout the scriptures. He's not doing anything by accident. So
It's kind of like he brought it back full circle where they started, full circle back.
Yeah.
Well, that's the story of the gospel, is reconciliation. We're always going back to, he's drawing us back to him. So
yeah. And from perfect relationship with the Lord in the garden to uninhibited relationship with the Lord in the new heavens and new earth, like in the New Jerusalem in Revelation. Like God's desire is to have that kind of relationship with his people. And he made it so. He made it possible. And so, yeah. There's a book that I read years ago. I don't know if I kept it. It wasn't super good. But it's called From Garden to City. And it was looking at the arc of the story of the Bible, and God's development of culture throughout is what the book was about. But it was an interesting perspective to say, like, all of these things that God is doing along the way are getting to this point where, like, the new Jerusalem, it just makes sense, like, that God would do that because he's been building us this way for all this time. So yeah, but there's all kinds of stuff like that.
I mean, it's
any
still
other
amazing to think the God who created everything around us loves us so intensely, and most people just don't even have a clue that he loves us so desperately much.
Yeah. So that's the people of Israel were called to be priests to the nations, the followers of Jesus. Peter says that we are a royal priesthood even now. And so part of the priest's job is to proclaim the love of God to the people, to show them the value and the wonder of trusting the Lord, like that he is good and he is worth it. But it's hard because there's all kinds of voices calling all kinds of directions. So, yeah. All right. Any other thoughts or observations from 8 through 11?
Just love it's so relevant to today. It's so old, but it's so relevant. And I've always thought of the Old Testament as outdated and archival, old, Sea Scroll kind of thing. But I'm reading this and I'm reading this is the amplified version in 10:19. Show your love for the stranger. I mean, how applicable is that in today's life? Yeah. It's just crazy how it just doesn't age, or it ages so well.
Yeah. Well, it's timeless.
Yeah.
So yeah, when I read these Old Testament passages where the Lord is holding up the cause of the vulnerable, the marginalized, the fatherless, the widow, the poor, and the foreigner among you. And I look at our country in particular. Now, America is not Israel. Okay. And so God's conversation with America is going to be different than God's conversation with Israel, like on the national conversation. But as a person who trusts the Lord, like, I look at the motivations of our culture, and we're so far from God's motivations. And even like in churches that are, focused more on my prosperity instead of the well-being of my neighbor. Like, it just grieves me so deeply that we are so far off from what God is challenging us to and inviting us into, and like the path of blessing. It's heartbreaking. So like as an individual, then it's like, how can I be better? Like, how can I display God's love to the poor and the vulnerable in a more tangible way, knowing that it is not my works, it's not my righteousness that saves me, but it is the righteousness of God that transforms us from the inside out. And so that should be displayed in the world around us. And so, so these passages, like the years and years ago, in 2015, so not 6 years ago, I guess, they were preparing for the election season, because every year is a preparation for an election, it seems like. And, there was a massive surge of Syrian refugees all over the world. And, our own government was trying to figure out what to do with this. And it just grieved me to see how churches and Christians saying we should not welcome any of these refugees here. Like, why? Why? And the Christians, we cannot like just say like, no refugees, because it's just undoing a whole bunch of what the Bible we just read. Care for the foreigner, they're refugees. And it just, I couldn't abide it. So it really grieved me. So, but anyway, that's a whole nother.
Did it have something to do with them being Muslim?
It had everything to do with them being Muslim. So, but the Lord here in these commands to care for these refugees.
He doesn't call out Muslims, except Muslims.
Yeah, he's not calling out their religion. He's calling out their hard place of their life. Like, they're desperate. And so,
I love that God never says except. He never says except this group or except that group. Love everybody except that one. There's none of that. That's our interpretation.
Well, there's one. There's Jacob have I loved, Esau have I hated. Like, there's that.
Okay.
So there's when we start working in absolutes, that's the path of the Sith, Megan. So, but there's things like what even the Canaanites here, like the Canaanites in the land, God is saying, drive them out. They are wicked. They are abhorrent. They are not good, right? Their wickedness is corrupting the land that God promised to Abraham. So there is a drive them out. But after the Lord, they have established themselves, the people of Israel are supposed to be this light to the nations, where foreigners, where refugees are like, that's where hope is. And like for followers of Jesus today, like, we should still be a people who people would look at and say, that's where hope is. And I'm looking for hope. And more than anybody's religion or identities in this world, like, will Christians be known as people of hope? Because what else do we have? What else do we have? And I feel, in my experience, there are plenty of Christians who are not known as hopeful people. So we're not attractive to the desperate and the marginalized.
Should it be Christians be known by their love?
Yes.
As well as hope.
Yeah. Faith, hope, and love. These are the greatest. And the greatest of these is love. So, yeah. And how Jesus' command to the disciples to love one another, that is a real hard one too, because they outsiders will know you are my disciples by how you love one another. Mm-hmm. And so the community of love, is one of the dramatic changes that the church needs more of. We need more love. I'm getting all mushy and soft in my old age. So, but yeah, I mean,
You're not wrong. So
thank you. All right, can you guys hear that? Youth group's over, so
Gotta go. The pastor's gotta go.
they're destroying something upstairs, so I don't know what's going on. Wow. All right, I bet it's my daughter saying, I bet my dad's really annoyed right now. So all right, so I'll see you all later.
Okay, thanks, Jason.
Bye.
Thanks for a good
Thank you,
first time.
Jason.
Yeah, good to see you.
Bye, guys.
Good to see you too.